Okay, now that we have taken the time to describe social change, let's see what the author has to say about prescribing social change to stay on a path to sustainable development and resilience or safe society. The following section is devoted to presenting some of my own humble ideas of social change that would be favorable for sustainability. So even though he's prescribing them, he's saying this is how I see this change that would be favorable for sustainability. So that's definitely more humble. To give this account some structure, I organize my thoughts according to the common levels of analysis of macro, meso and micro levels, though they are obviously closely related to each other as they are simply different hierarchical levels of the same human environment system. Since it's inherently difficult to imagine a society as radically different as after the previous two fundamental transformations without coming across as a science fiction novelist, I restrain myself to suggest changes that are substantial and difficult but imaginable and probably required at this point. At the macro level of countries and international systems, it's vital that we transcend the contemporary paradigm of seeing the world as divided into competing states. Such political realism has roots as far back as Thucydides in ancient Greece from the 1956 book on it, or the paper, and is still still the dominant paradigm regardless of the intervention of the UN system, World Trade Organization and other international institutions that merely give structure to the still overwhelmingly competitive interaction of states. This requires a separate dialogue about whether competition by nature is wrong or detrimental, or actually can it work as a creative tension where you compete but you share the outcomes of the innovations in a more equitable and non-zero sum game. It doesn't have to be that one wins and the other one loses. Non-zero world is described by, I think, Robert Wright in a book called Non-Zero, where we often have these dealings where, let's say, Steve Jobs invents the iPhone and the iPad, and I'm happy to buy it at a very high price even because it helps me do my work. So he makes his money, I make my money. There is no competition. But Steve Jobs, of course, was a very competitive guy, and Apple is right now in court because they are accused of suppressing competition by monopolistic games. So that's where the difference is between competition becoming monopoly versus competition being something that benefits everybody still, right? Alliances are forged if they benefit our own cause, and agreements honored only if not undermining our position in the global order. There are countless examples of this, out of which the North American reluctance to sign or ratify Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is relevant in this context. It would obviously be highly beneficial for the world if all states ratified and followed such crucial agreements for sustainability, but considering the number and diversity of states in the world, there is still little hope for that, as long as not doing so brings benefit for the freeloaders. So whether the word freeloader is appropriate here is also not clear, even though rich countries, including North America, have caused the cumulative carbon that's causing the warming and impacting the global south or the poor countries. They still want to protect their economic growth and their land and innovations, markets and so on. So are they freeloading, or are they saying, I don't care what my impacts are, I'm going to continue? And if others start taking actions to reduce emissions, then obviously US then becomes a freeloader on a world that is reducing emissions, but US continues, or North America continues. And when there are many freeloaders, or when they include some of the wealthiest and largest contributors to the problem, in this case emissions, fingers are starting to be pointed at each other and arguments for dropping out are heard. If they are not doing it, why should we? Another problem with the paradigm of seeing the world as divided into states is that it makes us lose perspective on our sustainability challenges. For instance, Western populations are in the top concerning greenhouse gas emissions per person, but the situation becomes even worse if accounting for the emissions related to producing all that is consumed in the West but manufactured elsewhere, mostly China, for example, an issue that receives little attention in both scientific and policy-making circles, but which effectively obscures the actual situation from being visible and addressed. Actually, this question is being attempted to be addressed. Europe wants to put carbon tax on goods coming in, but this creates other problems, and China is having an economic growth of its dreams while taking on the pollution of manufacturing for the world, and so on. So these are complicated, and per capita emissions have other complications. The US on average is high, India is low, but the rich in India consume almost at the same level as the US. So we are averaging over, and this is the same for China as well. So we're averaging over large range of carbon footprints, so I have to be careful about that as well, right? So similarly, Western-based companies export toxic waste from states with implemented environmental legislation to states with more lenient approaches to waste management, or just dump it there when nobody is watching or turning a blind eye in exchange for money under the table. The Dutch multinational company Trafigura is one example of such a company selling chemical waste either knowingly or unknowingly to be dumped in a developing country, this time Côte d'Ivoire, in 2006. So the Dutch are very careful about climate action. They are very close to sea level, so they are also working with the European Union to do, progressive climate actions, renewable energy, EVs, and so on. And yet they are, turning a blind eye to their own dumping of chemical waste elsewhere. Although prize-winning investigating journalists reported proof against Trafigura, and it is fair to assume that the company at least must have wondered how the newly established Ivorian company was going to process the waste for a price everybody else declined, for a price that is not prize. Trafigura paid a hefty compensation to Côte d'Ivoire and was thus exonerated from further legal processes. Even when tens of people have died, tens of thousands have turned ill as a direct consequence of the chemical waste that was dumped there by the Dutch. So it's not, of course, all Dutch government's fault, but Ivory Coast itself, Côte d'Ivoire itself, is corrupt and took the money and didn't protect its own people. It would be naive not to assume that there will always be criminal activity going on, just like there is always power and power disparity in terms of domination versus authority versus legitimacy and so on. But if we cannot transcend this current world order and start seeing and treating our sustainability challenges holistically, I'm afraid we will continue to fight a losing battle. People often refer to the need of a great threat to unite otherwise quarreling parties, but what can be more threatening than the challenges described in the first part of this book? So we'll look at the prop here as earth burning. What can be more threatening? I'm never a big fan of such images. They are meant to, I guess, get us thinking about things or be more careful or act better and so on and so forth, but they don't really work for me. Nonetheless, there is the other part of this where we are saying we must change our way to be sustainable and equitable at the same time, and not dumping chemical waste on corrupt countries, poor countries, but also the competition that we talked about as being all bad could actually be leading us to solutions that can allow us to maintain our lifestyle of high consumption without greenhouse gas emissions and without degrading the planet. Is it possible? Well, if we are going to imagine social change, then we may also imagine innovations coming out of competitions. So make money, save the world, and be happy. Can that be possible? Well, think for yourself. The example above has already brought us into the meso level of cities, regions, and governmental authorities, private companies, civil society organizations, etc., where we find similar challenges with lack of holistic approaches. First of all, we need to acknowledge that the context people exist in is an indivisible whole and not actually sliced up in functional sectors, administrative levels, and geographical areas. These are just tools to grasp the complexity of our world, which unfortunately are often applied in such a way that they obscure more than they illuminate. Okay, so we have to just be careful about every angle. You need a 360 view of all these problems. Different sectors and or actors are dependent on each other in various ways, sometimes to greater degree than within the sector or organization itself. So we're talking about meso level actors doing their bit in creating holistic approaches to sustainability as a whole for the planet, for global humans. But is it possible in the current paradigm of competition and economic markets and capturing the markets, monopolizing the markets, and so on? Okay, so similarly, there may be greater dependencies between cities or local communities across a border than within the geopolitical areas containing them. So you may have competitions of a city with a city in another country for, let's say, financial markets like Singapore versus Hong Kong versus London versus Mumbai, and so on. The people of a community, city, or any human environment system perceive their context as a whole, but as soon as we organize ourselves to grasp or address this context, we need to focus on particular parts of it. That is okay, but only if we still remember that the part we focus on is intrinsically connected to the rest, and that many sustainability challenges cut across these artificial boundaries. In other words, we need to change current institutional framework to better facilitate collaboration and holistic approaches. Of course, the problem is how to do it. So we'll come back and continue this discussion on prescribing social changes as humbly as the author wants to do it. The question is always about implementing those prescribed changes. Even when something is obvious, if there are winners and losers and freeloading is possible, then change may become not so easy. So ideas are good to have them on the table, and everybody knows that this is what we need, but where the motivation will come from or how we will make it happen is something we have to discuss. So we'll come back and continue in the next podcast.